In this video, I'm going to show 20 different watercolor techniques that I teach within the classroom. Our first technique is the most basic but also essential, the wash. A wash is an area filled in with paint. Right here, I'm doing a wet on dry wash, which means I'm simply applying paint onto dry paper. To get a smooth wash, you want to have plenty of paint loaded up in your brush. You also want to have a brush that's not too small for the area you're working in. A brush that's too small will leave lots of lines and streaks inside of the paint. You can see here with this medium-sized brush that I'm sweeping back and forth in an overlapping pattern. That's going to give me the smoothest application of paint. And when you lift off your brush, sometimes there's going to be a little blob of extra color that leaves a mark. You may need to go back in with a dry brush and pick that up. Technique number 2 is the water lift. The water lift builds upon our first technique, the wash. Here on this dry paper, I'm going to fill in a wash of color, and then it needs to dry completely before we can do step 2 of the water lift. I found that a wash on dry paper works better than a wet on wet wash. When the paint is completely dry, fill your brush with clean water and paint a design as if you were painting with invisible ink. As you're applying the water to the dry surface, it's rehydrating your pigments. Kind of work the brush back and forth into your design so that that color is hydrated again. Then it's just a simple matter of blotting it with a paper towel. Be sure to blot straight up and down. Don't wipe the paper towel over the paint because that might cause your watercolor paper to ball and pill up. So straight up and down blot. Technique number 3 is the graded wash. You might know this by the term ombre. For a graded wash, first you need to fill in your area with clean water. This is part of a wet on wet technique where the paper is wet before you apply the color. So my circle has a sheen of water. It's not a puddle, but it is wet enough to glisten. Then I'm going to apply some paint to a very small section, just at the top edge with this red here. We don't want the color to take over, which you'll see here in a moment how easily that can happen. Rinse your brush, and then at the edge where your color meets the water, swipe your paintbrush over the edge of the paint into the area of your paper that's still wet. You're going to soften that edge and just sort of carry a little bit of your color down. Sweep back and forth like we did on our first wash to get the smoothest area of color. Rinse your brush one more time so that you get rid of all that contaminating color and soften the very bottommost edge. This also makes sure that you don't end up with a hard line. If any part of the circle stays dry, when the color finishes moving, you'll see there's actually a hard edge. So we have clean water in the entire circle to make sure it gives it a really soft, hazy transition. This is what a graded wash should look like, but if yours doesn't look like this for several tries, please understand it's very difficult to achieve a smooth fade. Plastic wrap is the next technique. For this, you're going to need a small piece of plastic wrap, saran wrap, whatever you call it by, and a couple pieces of masking tape. We are going to fill in the circle with a wash of color. That's technique number 1. So fill in the area completely with color, and you want there to be quite a bit of paint sitting on the surface, kind of a puddle, enough that you can see it sitting there and it's not completely absorbed into the paper. Next, take your small piece of plastic wrap and with your fingers carefully pinch the plastic wrap into some crinkles. Get some folds and creases in the plastic wrap before pressing it onto your wet paint. So you'll need to do that fairly quickly. Holding the plastic wrap into the paint, take your pieces of masking tape or a heavy object and tape the plastic wrap down so that it stays very close to the surface of the paper and that wet paint gets stuck in all the creases and wrinkles. After you've given it plenty of time to dry underneath the plastic, you can peel up the plastic wrap and throw that away, revealing the almost shattered glass-like appearance of the technique. If you don't hold the plastic wrap tightly to the wet paint, you'll get a softer, hazier, less crisp appearance. This next technique may go by other names, but I call it blossoming, like a flower opening its petals. First, you want to start with a clean wash of water in the space you're going to be working with. You need the water to sort of have a sheen on top of your paper. Don't let it absorb too much. Then pick up a little bit of color and you can just lightly tap your paintbrush to the wet surface and you'll see the paint rapidly spread out into the water. For this technique, you can also do the same steps, but instead of touching your brush directly to the surface, you can load up your brush with color and pinch it from above. Please note that the paint will spread much further this way. Technique 6 is wet on wet. It's like the blossoming where we are applying wet paint onto wet paper, starting with a clear wash. But instead of keeping our marks of color separate, we are encouraging them to fade and swirl into each other due to the paper being wet. So here I am starting with one color and then I'm going to go in with a second color and fill in all of the spaces. I'm encouraging the colors to swirl and fade into one another. This is all possible because I wet the paper before I applied the paint. For soft, hazy marks, you want a wet surface. For crisp marks, you need a dry surface. That's why this technique is called wet on wet. The first wet is the paint, the second wet is the paper. Number 7 is Frisket, a liquid latex mask. Masking is simply protecting an area so that color can't touch it. For this, we're going to use a product that you may want to notice exposure may cause allergic reactions because it contains natural rubber latex. So if you're not sure if you're allergic to latex, you might test this in a small space on the back of your wrist. For students in my class who know they're allergic to this, you can just write the word allergy in this technique circle and skip it. When using Frisket, you want to always protect your bristles by working a little bit of dish soap into them. This will make it easier to wash the Frisket out later and keep it from drying and clogging in your bristles. After the dish soap is in the bristles, dip into some of the Frisket and start painting the design that you want to keep the paint off of. As you're applying the Frisket, be sure to paint your design on rather thickly so that it sort of bubbles and domes above the surface. This way you know you have enough rubber latex protecting that area and your color won't accidentally seep through that. Leave it to dry for several hours before you follow up with some paint. The frisket needs to have turned to rubber before you apply some color. Go ahead and brush it right on and over the frisket, and you'll notice it repels it and keeps it from touching the paper in those areas. When you're done applying your paint, give it some more time to dry. Once the paint has fully dried, you can go in and actually remove the frisket. You can do that by just using your fingertip. You can get it started with an eraser on your pencil, or actually use a product meant to help you peel the frisket, like this eraser type material here. Sort of rub across the frisket until the rubber starts to ball up, and from there you should be able to peel that off the surface. Please peel carefully and slowly to make sure you don't rip your paper fibers as you remove this product. Technique number 8 is using masking tape. Again, we are masking an area off on our painting, meaning we are protecting an area from color. So I'm going to use this nice 3M painter's tape, where there are other masking tapes that are cheaper and more likely to tear your paper. So I recommend investing in some quality painter's tape that will let go easily and not damage your paper. An important step in this process once you've applied the tape is to always go back in and press the tape firmly down. Use your fingernail to seal the tape closely to the surface so no paint seeps under the edges. If you want, you can cut shapes out of your tape using scissors or a craft knife. But you should be able to apply the watercolor directly over and up to the tape, and if it has a good seal, it will keep that area crisp and white so that none of your color gets to touch the paper in those areas. When your paint has completely dried, carefully peel your tape, trying to peel parallel to the paper so that you're less likely to rip the paper surface. You can also use an X-Acto blade if you're having trouble getting the tape peeled off, just to kind of lift up the edge. Technique number 9 is a wax resist. For this, I'm just going to use a simple white crayon so that the white wax doesn't really show on the white paper. Draw the design that you want to repel the paint, and draw pressing very firmly on the crayon, going over your design multiple times. It's really important on this technique that you get a lot of wax applied to the paper. If it's just a thin line drawing like once, you'll find that the paint doesn't get repelled in those areas and your design won't show up. So take the time to kind of scribble and press over your design real hard. When you're happy with your design, pick up some paint. Make sure it's plenty fluid, not too thick and syrupy. Apply your color over the design and voila, you'll see the wax repelling the color. This one, again, is better with darker colors, whereas lighter colors like yellow don't have enough contrast to really show off the wax resist. Here I drew a W once and did not go over it. You can see it didn't show up. Number 10, salt, is one of my very favorite techniques. Start off with a wash of water. So this is a wet on wet technique. Wet the paper first and then apply whatever color or colors you want. Darker colors tend to show up the marks better than lighter colors like yellow. How much water you apply to the paper is very critical, and how quickly you work is also important. I have just a sheen of water on there before I apply my paint, not a big old puddle. Fill in some color and then get your table salt at the ready. I'm going to shake a little bit from the shaker into my palm and then pinch it and sprinkle the granules of salt directly into the still wet color. As you sprinkle the salt onto your wet watercolor, try to space it out. Just a little bit is gonna do a lot. You don't want a pile of salt because then the grains of salt are too crowded and they won't be able to do their thing. There's just too much salt. Give it a while to absorb the water and the pigment out of the surrounding areas, and you'll see how the grains of salt create these little starburst marks. Really beautiful and fun. You can do the same thing with rock salt as you can with table salt, though I recommend actually wetting the rock salt before you place it on the wet paint. Number 11, iced tea. This one is a lot like the table salt technique, where you're going to create a wash of color and then, as the name implies, sprinkle grains of iced tea onto the still wet watercolor. Here I have just some unsweetened iced tea, and I'm going to take a pinch of that and sprinkle the grains of iced tea out onto the still wet watercolor. How wet the paper is and how much water is in your paint is going to affect the appearance of this technique. If it's a little on the drier side, you're going to have a small, fine, crisp mark, but wetter surface and more water in your paint is going to dissolve the iced tea more. Number 12, rubbing alcohol. Did you know that basic medicinal rubbing alcohol has a really cool effect on watercolors? To do this technique, you want to fill in an area with a wash of color. Could be wet on wet or wet on dry. Working quickly while the paint is still wet, you're going to drop a little bit of rubbing alcohol directly onto the paint. Here I'm using a pipette to control how much rubbing alcohol I drop, but you can drip it off of a fingertip or just dip your paintbrush in. As I drop the rubbing alcohol into the wet paint, it has a reaction where it repels the paint, and it causes these really neat ripple-like marks. For this technique, you want to use some restraint. As fun as it is to watch the ripples spread, if you do too many drops of rubbing alcohol, when it dries, it's very difficult to tell what sort of technique was being used, and it will obscure it. Technique 13 is the dry brush. First off, if you've been working with your paintbrush or have rinsed it recently, you need to dry out your bristles with a paper towel. Next, you need to load up your paintbrush with some paint. At first, when you start to apply the paint, you're going to get a more solid layer of color. But you need to get rid of some of the extra paint to the point where you start getting a scratchy, jagged appearance. That is what is characteristic of dry brush. When you don't have enough paint loaded in your bristles to properly cover the area. The bristles will skim over the texture of the paper and leave sort of a rough texture to it. That's what you want. 14 is stipple. For this technique, you're going to want a very specific type of paintbrush. A synthetic brush, like this golden Taklon, is a stiffer bristle that wants to hold its shape together. It's not going to be a good choice for this. Now, these natural hair brushes are a better choice. The smaller paintbrush is a little bit too small. There's not enough bristles to achieve the dots that we're going for. So you want a slightly larger, a medium-sized brush that you can splay the bristles apart and they stay spread apart like this. We're going to be using the points of the bristles to make some very fine dots. So first off, dry out your brush. If it's too wet, they'll want to clump together, but it's okay if the bristles are just a little bit damp. Splay the bristles apart, kind of like a feather duster, and try to dip the end of your brush into paint. Typically, the paint in the bristles makes it then want to clump together, so it can take a little bit of effort to have paint in your brush, but also have your bristles separated so that they make fine clumps. Sometimes you just need to take your fingers to move the bristles apart. When the bristles are separated and have paint, you're going to just barely tap the end of your paintbrush onto the paper. It's generally a good idea to always check this technique off to the side before making the final mark. Don't smush the brush down flat completely, just barely tap it up and down on the paper. While tapping your bristles straight up and down to make these fine polka dots, be sure to rotate the handle while you're making the marks so that it's not just cloning the same dots again and again. Variety is going to help your texture. If you have too much water or too much paint in your bristles, it's just going to hold the bristles together. Technique 15 is the scumble. Some may describe scumble a little differently than I am, so bear in mind this is for my classroom. Don't choose a synthetic bristle like Taklon for this. You want a softer bristle like a natural hair. On a paintbrush, we have the metal ferrule, the heel where the bristles meet the ferrule, and some describe the bristles as a foot. And you look at it kind of like this. So we're going to be pushing the bristles sideways, kind of like a foot with a heel, in order to do this technique. Make sure your paintbrush isn't too wet or too full of paint. You want to get rid of some of the extra on the side, like maybe on a paper towel. Then, with the bristles slightly angled, sort of a 90-degree angle, lightly tap the bristles against the paper. Don't completely smush it down, just lightly tap the splayed out bristles and you'll get a very soft feathery mark. If you have too much water or too much paint in your brush, it's just going to clump and make a big blob. That's not what a scumble looks like. I call this next technique the split end, though I'm not sure how other artists call it. For this, we'll be using a fan brush with the bristles shaped like so. If your fan brush has gotten a little clumped, you can kind of pull the bristles apart and smush the metal ferrule to hold it in the proper shape. If you don't have a fan brush, a natural hair brush will do. Just take the bristles, kind of splay them to the left and to the right with your fingers and pinch them into a flat shape. As long as the brush has a little bit of moisture in it, the bristles should hold that shape and work like a pseudo fan brush. Begin by lightly dipping your paintbrush into the paint. You don't want to dunk the whole thing, just put the tips of the bristles into some color. Before making your final mark, I always recommend testing this technique off to the side on a scrap piece of paper or some paper towel. The bristles, depending on how much paint you picked up, can clump and obscure the effect of this technique, so it's a good idea to test it to the side to make sure you get the mark you're looking for. After you've loaded up your brush with some color, lightly put the end of the brush to the paper and pull towards yourself. Just the end of the brush should be gliding over the paper. Don't smush the entire side of the brush. 17 is the sea sponge. Sponges are a great way to add some texture to your artwork, but not all sponges are equal. Some sponges are synthetic. They're man-made, so the pores are very homogeneous and the surface is typically flat. But if you get a natural sea sponge, it has a lot of texture, the pores are different sizes, and it's a great way for adding a little random texture. Take your sea sponge and dip it into some color. Here I'm dipping directly into my palette of color, but dipping in a mixing tray can be a little easier. Once you have a little bit of color, lightly tap it onto your paper. You want to rotate the sponge so that the marks you make are randomized and not the same set of marks again and again. Now, as you are making texture with your sea sponge, there's two things you want to watch out for. One, is your sponge damp or is it dry? A dry sponge will make crisper marks, whereas a damp sponge, say someone used it recently and washed it out, it's going to blob your colors together a little more. Pressure is also key. If you lightly tap your sponge on the surface, you're going to get a crisper, finer mark. If you press down on the sponge and compress it against the paper, your marks are going to bleed together more. Spatter is a fun technique that just about anyone who's ever played with watercolors knows about. But with great power comes great responsibility. This technique is very messy, so always protect your surroundings to control where the spray of paint goes, and be careful not to get it on your neighbor's artwork. The most successful spatter technique starts with very fluid paint. If your paint is really viscous and thick, you're gonna get long strings in your spatter. If it's more fluid, you're gonna get a finer spray. One way is to tap a paintbrush with another paintbrush that's loaded with color. Tapping it against the ferrule above the surface of the paper is going to cause some of the paint to leave the brush. Another way to do the spatter technique is to use an old toothbrush. Take this toothbrush, dip it into a little bit of color, place your thumb at the beginning of the brush, pull back, and let fly. The resulting action will cause a very fine spray of color to fly forward. A comparison of the two techniques shows that the tapping method creates a slightly larger dot, whereas the toothbrush typically creates a finer mist of marks. Technique 19 is the liner technique. I just call it the liner technique because we're going to use a liner brush. These are both considered liner brushes because they have a very fine, long bristle. Sometimes they're called a rigger brush or a script brush. But when full of paint or water, it can make an extremely fine mark. The liner technique must be done on a dry surface in order to create a crisp, fine mark that stays put. If the surface is wet, your marks will spread out and be hazy. Bear in mind, the liner technique can be done on top of a wash of color or any of the other effects that we've done. The key is that whatever surface you're working on, it must be dry at the time of the liner technique. Last but not least, technique number 20 is the straw technique. You're going to need a full straw or just a piece of it, and you're going to make a puddle of color near the base of your workspace. Leave space around it for the paint to flow when we start using our straw. Apply the color thick and heavy in a puddle, point to the end of the straw directly above the color, and put as much air through the straw as you can muster. If you're having a hard time with the straw technique, chances are your paint is too thick. Try adding a little bit of water to dilute it so that it flows better when the air reaches the paint. Thanks for watching!